George Wilson, a member of the elite SEAL Team 6, was on his way to a top-secret mission. In full uniform and gear, he knew there was no room for error. Every mission carried a high level of danger, and focus was critical. He drove with his eyes locked on the road, alert to every movement. His heart pounded as if it might leap out of his chest, an adrenaline rush he knew all too well before every mission. The team was already waiting for him at the base, ready to kick off the operation. All security protocols were in place, as always. The SEALs' cell phone tracking system was precise, designed to monitor their locations in real time. If any team member remained in one place for too long without communicating, it would automatically trigger an alert. When that happened, a clear procedure followed. A coded message would be sent, a phone call would be made, and if there was no response, reinforcements would be dispatched immediately. Suddenly, as George drove down the empty, quiet road, he noticed something in his rearview mirror, a police car approaching with its lights flashing. He frowned, knowing he hadn't been speeding. With little choice, he pulled over, aware that any delay could impact the mission. George kept his composure as the officer, identified as Jake, stepped out of the squad car with heavy steps and an aggressive stance. Walking beside Jake was the second officer, Connor, who seemed uncomfortable with the situation. From the moment Jake approached, it was clear he intended to make a scene. License and registration, Jake demanded, his tone authoritative and condescending, leaving no room for doubt about his suspicion. George, still in uniform and obviously part of the military, realized Jake wasn't interested in a routine traffic stop. George held his gaze. "My ID is in the center console. May I reach for it?" George replied calmly. Before George could move, Jake drew his gun and pointed it directly at him. "Don't even think about it," Jake shouted. "Put your hands on your head and get out of the vehicle." Connor, standing nearby, looked nervous, sensing that things were escalating too far. "Let him go, Jake. Do you even realize who these guys are? He's part of the elite armed forces." Connor tried to warn his partner. "Are you out of your mind, Connor? This guy must be some lunatic who found that uniform." "I doubt this boy is who he claims to be," Jake sneered with a mocking grin. George sighed inwardly but followed the orders. He stepped out of the car slowly, hands on his head. "My ID is in the console." "Your partner's right, officer. You're about to get yourself into serious trouble," George tried to reason, making no sudden moves. "Shut up," Jake yelled, forcefully shoving George to the ground and slapping handcuffs on his wrists. Connor, watching the whole thing, feared what might happen next. He knew Jake's behavior was wrong, but fear of reprisal from his superior kept him silent. As Jake aggressively cuffed George, George's phone vibrated in his pocket. His team had already noticed he had been idle for too long. The protocol was straightforward. The team would send a coded message and George was supposed to respond. If no response came, they would call. If he didn't answer, they would treat it as a high-risk situation and send reinforcements immediately. Unable to respond to the code, George knew the next step would be the call. When his phone rang and he couldn't answer, it triggered the emergency protocol. Back at the base, George's silence after the message and missed call was enough for the team to launch a helicopter. They knew he was in trouble. The helicopter closed in quickly on the location, and the SEALs were ready to take action. Jake kept pushing George, oblivious to the danger heading his way. Suddenly, the sound of helicopter blades filled the air. Jake looked up, confused. "What the hell is that?" Jake asked, visibly irritated as he saw the helicopter approaching. "I warned you, officer," George said calmly. "My team's on the way." Jake, still in disbelief, raised his gun toward the helicopter. The booming voice from a loudspeaker echoed from the aircraft. "Hey, officer, lower your weapon for your own safety. You're dealing with the United States Navy SEALs." Jake looked around, bewildered and anxious, as SEAL rifles were trained on him. He hesitated but finally lowered his gun, letting it fall slowly to the ground. The SEALs swiftly descended on ropes, performing an impressive headfirst, fast-rope maneuver. In seconds, they disarmed the officers and pinned them to the ground with precision, a firm boot pressing into the small of their backs. Connor stood frozen in shock, while Jake was humiliated. "Are you insane, officer? Mistreating one of us?" "We're relentless and unpredictable," the SEAL leader scolded him. "You have no idea what kind of training we go through, situations you couldn't dream of enduring. How dare you assault one of our own?" At that moment, George's handcuffs were removed. He stood up, calmly walked to the car, grabbed his ID, and held it right in front of Jake's face. "You see this? Can you read? Do you understand who I am now? I'm from the elite of the Navy," George said firmly. Jake, sweating and humiliated, nodded in silence. "Even though it's not written on my ID, you should know who you're dealing with," George added. The SEAL commander looked at Jake and said, "We're gonna teach you a lesson, kid. This bully needs some correction. You're coming with us." Jake, terrified, was cuffed and hung upside down in the helicopter. Connor, still on the ground, asked, "Are you guys insane? What are you gonna do to him?" "Stay out of it, kid. This one's gonna learn the hard way," the commander replied. During the flight, Jake began to feel nauseous, vomiting due to the maneuvers while being upside down. When they landed back at the same spot, he was released but clearly shaken. The commander looked at Jake. "You okay, kid?" he asked with a cold smile. "Yes, sir," Jake replied, visibly terrified. "Good. And don't mess with one of us again, understood?" the commander said, his tone threatening. "Otherwise, we'll come after you." George stepped closer and, before leaving Jake, punched him in the stomach. "That's just a courtesy for roughing me up, you idiot." The commander turned to Jake one last time. "I could ruin your career, have you arrested, but today, I'm being generous. Consider this a man's lesson. We're leaving now, and you'll return to your job without pulling any more stunts, got it?" Jake nodded, still scared. "Now let's get out of here," said the commander, looking at George. "We're late. Leave your car here. We'll come back later to pick it up." Then he turned to Jake. "When we come back, I want that car untouched. That's your responsibility." The helicopter took off with a roar. As it disappeared into the distance, Jake looked at Connor, visibly humiliated. "Damn, I think I pissed my pants." Connor chuckled. "Serves you right, man. I told you that guy was serious. You should have let him go." Jake glared at his partner. "What are you laughing at? These guys report directly to the president, Jake. If they want, they can end your career. You screwed up and almost took me down with you. I don't want to work with you anymore." Jake, still angry, replied, "Whatever. Just don't tell anyone at the department what happened here." The same day the incident with the SEALs occurred, Connor couldn't shake the humiliation he and Jake had endured due to Jake's reckless actions. Connor knew he didn't want to work with Jake anymore, so he decided to talk to the department chief. In the chief's office, the air was tense. The chief, an experienced man with a sharp eye, noticed Connor's serious expression and raised an eyebrow. "What's going on, Connor? Is everything all right?" the chief asked, suspicious. "Did Jake do something wrong on duty?" Connor hesitated, almost stammering. He didn't want to cause more trouble but couldn't lie. No, sir. It's not like that. I just didn't adapt to working with him, that's all," Connor said, trying to sound convincing. The chief watched him for a long moment, clearly doubting his response, but eventually nodded. "All right, I'll transfer you to a different team. But keep an eye out, Connor. If there's a problem, I need to know," the chief said, still scrutinizing him. Outside, Jake was leaning against the coffee machine, watching Connor through the chief's office window. When Connor came out, Jake approached him, raising an eyebrow. "Hey man, did you say anything to the chief?" Jake asked, his tone provocative. "Knock it off, Jake. I just asked to be transferred," Connor replied, trying to avoid further conflict. Jake looked suspicious but didn't push it. Connor walked away, relieved he no longer had to work with Jake. Now partnered with Foster, a popular cop known for talking too much, Connor felt more comfortable venting. While on patrol, he couldn't hold back from sharing what had happened the day before. "Man, Jake's a handful. Yesterday was a disaster. He treated a SEAL Team 6 member like garbage. We were humiliated in front of them." Connor started as Foster listened closely. "Wow, what an idiot. Your ex-partner sounds like a total moron." "That must have been humiliating," Foster responded, shaking his head in disbelief. Before they could continue, their radio crackled with an urgent message. "Attention, all units. Robbery in progress at Joe's Beans Cafe. Suspect vehicle, gray SUV, plate ending in 6783. Proceed with caution during the stop. Foster quickly turned on the lights and siren of the patrol car. Let's go, Connor. We need to catch that thief. We'll deal with your ex-partner's story later, Foster said, stepping on the gas as they sped towards the cafe. The adrenaline was pumping as Foster and Connor raced through the streets, trying to catch up with the suspect's SUV. The vehicle sped through narrow streets, and the chase was intense. As they got closer, the car made a sharp turn and managed to evade them. Damn, that was close, Connor exclaimed, frustrated. Yeah, we'll get them next time, Foster replied, determined. The chase had been thrilling but unsuccessful. However, Connor's mind was still on Jake, knowing that sooner or later he'd have to deal with the situation. The next day, the entire department already knew what had happened with Jake. The incident with the SEALs had spread like wildfire, and when Jake walked into the station, all eyes were on him. Whispers, discreet chuckles, and mocking glances followed him down the hallway. As Jake walked toward his desk, the chief called him into his office. Jake, I need to talk to you, the chief said seriously. Jake entered the office with a stern expression, but the chief wasn't in the mood to go easy on him. What you did yesterday was unacceptable. Do you have any idea who you were dealing with? You put the entire department at risk with your rash actions. We're here to serve and protect, not to cause chaos. Do you understand? The chief scolded him harshly. Jake, visibly uncomfortable, nodded, but inside his anger was building. As soon as he left the chief's office, he went straight to find Connor. Jake found Connor in the department's parking lot, where the patrol cars were parked. He wasn't about to let things slide. Hey Connor, what did you tell the chief? Jake began, his voice filled with anger. Connor turned slowly, already knowing this could escalate into a fight. I already told you, Jake. I just asked to switch teams. I didn't say anything about you. Connor tried to keep calm, but Jake wasn't buying it. You're trying to screw me over, man. Everyone in the department is laughing at me because of that mess yesterday. Jake shouted, stepping closer in anger. Look, Jake, you messed up. If you're looking for someone to blame, take a look in the mirror. You treated an elite soldier like trash, and now you're paying the price. Own up to it, Connor replied, trying to end the argument. But Jake wasn't ready to listen. Shut up, Connor. You betrayed me. Now I've got to deal with this crap on my own. Jake snapped, furious. The tension rose, and other officers started gathering to watch the argument in the parking lot. The chief, noticing the commotion, watched from a distance, knowing the situation between Jake and Connor was far from over. After months on an intense mission in Afghanistan with SEAL Team 6, George Wilson was finally coming home. The adrenaline from the mission still coursed through his veins, but the weight of responsibility was beginning to lift as he approached the base. As he disembarked, he was greeted by one of his teammates, Sam, who offered to give him a ride to where George had parked his car. Man, you deserve a break, Sam said as the two of them got into the car. That mission was brutal. How about grabbing a beer later? Sounds good to me, George replied, smiling slightly. A beer sounds like the best idea after everything we've been through. They talked about the mission as Sam drove down the road. When they reached the spot where George had left his car, the two decided to keep the conversation going. How about we head over to that bar near the base? Sam suggested. We can relax a bit and talk more about the mission. Deal, George replied, getting into his own car and following Sam to the bar. The bar was packed. People were laughing and talking, and the atmosphere was exactly what George needed after weeks of high tension in the field. George and Sam found a table and ordered a couple of beers. The conversation started with Afghanistan but quickly shifted to more lighthearted topics. As they talked, a group of girls entered the bar and sat down not far from them. One of them, Anna, caught George's attention. She was outgoing, beautiful, and seemed to be having a great time with her friends. Those girls are checking us out, Sam said, chuckling. Probably because we look like two mysterious guys, George replied, smiling. Let's go talk to them. The two approached and ended up joining the girls at their table. The conversation flowed naturally. Anna stood out from the group, and she and George started exchanging more words. She was curious and charming. So, what do you two do for a living? Anna asked, leaning in with curiosity. George and Sam exchanged glances. "Oh, nothing too exciting," George said with an enigmatic smile. "We just work on things that are kind of classified." The girls laughed, but their curiosity grew. "Classified, huh?" Anna teased, trying to get more information out of them. "Something like that," Sam replied, enjoying the mystery. The night went on with laughs, conversation, and a few playful jabs about their jobs. George and Anna clearly hit it off, and by the end of the night, they exchanged phone numbers. In the weeks that followed, George and Anna continued seeing each other. The relationship grew quickly, and they started spending more and more time together. Anna was independent and had a strong personality, which George admired. Their attraction was turning into something deeper. As time went on, George felt more comfortable sharing bits and pieces of his life, although he still avoided talking about his true role in SEAL Team 6. He preferred to keep that part of his life a secret, at least for now. One day, while the two were relaxing in a park, Anna suggested something that made George a little nervous. "We've been together for a while now, George. I think it's time you met my parents." George smiled, but inside he felt a knot form in his stomach. "Sure, that'd be great. When do you want to do it?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "How about this weekend? My dad's going to love meeting you. He can be a bit tough, but he's nice." George agreed, not knowing that meeting Anna's parents would be more complicated than he expected. When the weekend arrived, George was eager to meet Anna's parents, unaware that her father, Jake, was the same cop who had mistreated him months ago. Anna hadn't mentioned her father's name, so George had no idea what he was walking into. They arrived at Anna's house, and she introduced him to her mother, a kind and welcoming woman. But the atmosphere shifted the moment her father appeared in the doorway. Jake froze the moment he saw George, the SEAL he had handcuffed and humiliated in front of his own team. George recognized him immediately but tried to keep his composure. "Dad, this is George, my boyfriend." Anna smiled, completely oblivious to the tension in the air. Jake stared at George, trying to process the situation. His expression fluctuated between surprise and discomfort. "George," Jake murmured, visibly unsettled, but extended his hand for a forced handshake. George shook his hand, even though both men knew there was much more going on than a simple introduction. The atmosphere was tense as they sat down for dinner. During dinner, everything seemed to be going well until Jake asked a question that shifted the entire tone of the conversation. "So, George, what do you do for a living?" Jake asked, his eyes scrutinizing George. George glanced at Anna, who smiled, encouraging him to answer. He knew the time had come to reveal the truth about his profession, even though it might make things uncomfortable. "Actually, I'm in the military," George began. "I'm a member of SEAL Team 6. A silence fell over the table. Anna's mother, Jessica, widened her eyes in surprise. "What?" Jessica exclaimed. "Your job is so dangerous." "My God, Anna, you've gotten yourself a boyfriend who goes on dangerous missions." George raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Relax, ma'am. We're highly trained," he said, trying to ease her concern. Anna rolled her eyes, smiling. "Mom, stop with all the drama. You're going to make George want to run away." Everyone chuckled lightly, except Jake, who watched the scene with a serious expression. He cleared his throat and sarcastically added, "Highly trained, huh? Sure." George picked up on Jake's tone but decided not to react. Anna noticed the tension and looked at her father. "Dad, what's going on? You don't seem very happy." Jake shook his head. "It's nothing. I just hope he takes good care of you." George remained composed. "You can rest assured, sir. Anna's safety is very important to me." Jessica tried to lighten the mood. "Well, how about we enjoy some dessert? I made that chocolate cake you love, Anna." The conversation continued, but the tension between George and Jake lingered. Anna felt like something wasn't being said but decided to save the discussion with George for later. At that moment, Jake interrupted the growing tension. "George, why don't we take a walk outside and talk?" Jake suggested, hinting at a private conversation. George nodded, knowing this was the moment Jake would likely confront him about the past. Outside the house, the tension between Jake and George was palpable. Jake, clearly uncomfortable, began to speak. "Look, I know I messed up when I dealt with you that day, Jake said, looking down. I wasn't having a good day, but your team humiliated me. And worse, my colleague told everyone at the department. Now, I'm the laughingstock at work. I'm humiliated. I've always been a good cop, with a solid record of arrests, Jake continued, while George listened in silence. What you don't understand is, on that day, I was dealing with trauma. A few days earlier, I'd stopped a black man who pulled a gun on me and nearly killed me. Life on the streets is dangerous, and I know you face even greater dangers, but you know what I'm talking about? Jake paused, his voice heavier. Now, I've got to deal with this mess at work, but when it comes to my family, I won't tolerate it. Sooner or later, you're going to tell my daughter everything. You should step away from her. I don't want you with her. George stood his ground, locking eyes with Jake. You humiliated me that day, Jake. You called me a boy, threw me to the ground, and you know very well your career could have ended right then. Instead, my team and I decided to teach you a lesson. Now things have changed, and here I am, dating your daughter. Life's full of surprises. George paused, his tone steady but controlled. And don't worry, I'll never mention this to Anna. I'm more of a man than you think. Jake stared at George, distrustful, but something in George's tone made him realize he was sincere. You may be part of the Navy's elite, but Anna is my daughter. Never lay a hand on her, or I'll take you down in 2 seconds. Jake's tone was protective, though lacking the arrogance it once held. George smiled slightly, recognizing the fatherly concern. You can relax, Jake. Your daughter will be treated like a princess, George responded seriously. At that moment, Anna appeared at the door, interrupting their conversation. Wow, you guys are still out here? She said, unaware of the tension that had just transpired. Jake and George exchanged a final look and nodded in silent understanding before heading inside together. Later that night, after dinner, Anna finally had a chance to open up to George. You lied to me, George. I'm upset with you, she began, her eyes filled with disappointment. George knew this conversation would be tough. I did it to protect you, Anna. My job is dangerous. I didn't want you to worry, George explained, gently taking her hand. Then why did you tell my dad when he asked? Anna asked, frowning. I don't get it. It seems like you two already know each other. George realized Anna was starting to piece things together. He knew he couldn't reveal everything, but he didn't want to lie again. He stopped me once while I was in uniform. It wasn't a big deal, that's all, George said, trying to keep his tone casual. I had to tell you the truth today. Anna remained silent, but something didn't sit right with her. The story felt incomplete, and her intuition told her there was more between George and her father than either was letting on. George knew this conversation was far from over. Anna was still confused and upset, but for now, he had no choice but to keep the truth hidden. Over the past few weeks, the relationship between George and Jake had changed. What was once filled with tension and distrust was slowly becoming more relaxed. One day, Jake suggested they go out for drinks and play some pool, and to George's surprise, he agreed. As they were getting ready to leave, Anna and her mother, Jessica, watched the two men approach the door. Bye, Dad. Don't be too hard on my boyfriend, okay? Anna said, laughing and shaking her head. Take good care of my husband, George, Jessica joked, giving her son-in-law a wink. Jake chuckled, and as they got into the car, he gave George a playful, challenging look. Today, I'm gonna kick your ass at pool, you punk. I owe you one from that day, Jake said, referring to the incident with the seals. George laughed, shaking his head. Let it go, Jake. We should have gotten over that by now. Jake smiled, showing that the topic was still a playful point between them. Navy's elite, huh? And now you want to date my daughter? You'd better marry her soon, or you'll have to answer to me. The two of them laughed, leaving behind any remnants of animosity. That night was about fun, not rehashing old issues. When they arrived at the bar, George and Jake ordered a couple of beers and grabbed some pool cues. Jake, with years of practice, was ready to show off his skills. They bet a round of beers to make the game more interesting. See, George? You may be part of the elite, but here at the pool table, you don't stand a chance, Jake said, sinking the 8-ball with ease. George chuckled, watching his father-in-law's smooth performance. I have to admit you're really good at this, Jake. They continued playing, laughing, and throwing friendly jabs. The once tense atmosphere between them was now light and relaxed. In the end, Jake won several rounds, and George, despite being competitive, took the loss in stride. "See that?" Jake said with a victorious grin. "You're young, George, but you've still got a lot to learn. You don't even know how to play pool properly." "I guess I'll need to practice more if I ever want to beat you, Jake," George replied, smiling. After several rounds of pool and many beers, the two stumbled out of the bar, laughing and having the time of their lives. George realized that despite their rocky start, Jake was just a simple man who wanted the best for his daughter. "Man, you surprised me. I never thought we'd end up here, drinking together after everything," George said as they tried to keep their balance. Jake laughed. "Life's funny like that, kid. But don't get too comfortable. In the end, I'm still her father, and you'll have to deal with me." They both laughed as they walked back to the car, their newfound friendship solidified. What once seemed impossible was now a reality. Jake and George, who had started as adversaries, were finally getting along. George and Anna's relationship was in a great place, and George decided it was time to introduce her to his parents. Anna was excited but a little nervous. George's mother, Christina, was a successful businesswoman in the textile industry, and his father, Nicholas, also had a strong career as a businessman. Despite this, Nicholas had always been against George's decision to join the military. He thought his son should have followed in the family's footsteps, but George had made it clear since he was young. His dream was to become an elite soldier. When they arrived at his parents' house, George was greeted warmly. Christina, a kind and always welcoming woman, hugged Anna affectionately. "You're even more beautiful than George described," Christina said with a warm smile. "I'm so happy he brought you here to meet us." Nicholas, though more reserved, shook Anna's hand and greeted her with a slight smile. The afternoon passed with pleasant conversation, and Anna quickly felt at ease. George's family shared stories about the early struggles in their careers and how they had built a textile empire from scratch through hard work and perseverance. "It's been a long road," Christina explained. "In the beginning, Nicholas and I worked long hours, with hardly any rest. But with hard work, we managed to achieve everything we have today." Anna was impressed. She admired Christina and Nicholas's determination and was starting to see parallels between their journey and what she could build with George. The day was filled with laughter and stories from George's childhood, and everything seemed perfect. At the end of the day, as George and Anna said their goodbyes to his parents, Nicholas made a more serious comment. "You know, George, I never liked your career choice, but I see now that you're doing what you love. I just hope that, in the future, you consider something safer for you and for those you love," Nicholas said, glancing subtly at Anna. George smiled and nodded, not wanting to get into a debate about his profession. On the drive back, George was taking Anna home. The conversation was light, and they both reflected on the pleasant day they'd spent with George's parents. Anna, still impressed, commented, "Your parents are amazing, George. I can see where your determination comes from. They started from nothing and built everything with so much hard work. It's really inspiring." George smiled, touched by her words. "Yeah, they're great role models for me. They always taught me that success only comes through hard work," he replied. Just then, George's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw his team commander's name. He knew he couldn't ignore the call. He answered, trying to hide the seriousness of the situation. "Hello, Commander." "Yes, I understand." "Yes, sir." George listened intently, his expression growing more serious. On the other end, the commander explained that they had just received last-minute intel about the location of one of the world's most dangerous terrorists, and the team needed to mobilize immediately for the mission. George remained calm and masked his reaction to avoid worrying Anna. "Okay, I'll be there as soon as possible," George said before hanging up. He turned to Anna, keeping his tone light. "It's just something for work. Nothing big." Anna smiled, not suspecting anything. "Okay, just don't get so caught up in work that you forget about me, okay?" she teased. George laughed, but inside, his heart was racing. He dropped her off at her house, knowing deep down that he was about to embark on a very dangerous mission. As soon as Anna walked inside, Jake, who had been sitting in the living room, observed George closely. He noticed a change in the young man's demeanor and sensed something was wrong. "Is everything all right, kid?" Jake asked, standing up and walking toward the door. George hesitated for a moment, but he knew Jake wasn't a fool. "More or less. We got an urgent call about the location of one of the biggest terrorists. I have to rush off on a mission with my team," George explained, his expression serious. "Please, Jake, keep this between us. Don't tell Anna. I don't want her to worry." Jake stayed silent for a few seconds, absorbing the gravity of the situation. He had been a cop for many years and understood what it meant to face dangerous situations. Despite their history, Jake understood George's request. "All right, it stays between us. Anna won't know a thing," Jake said, placing a hand on George's shoulder in a gesture of respect and understanding. "Take care out there, kid. Good luck to you and your team." George nodded. "Thanks, Jake. That means a lot." With Jake's blessing, George quickly left. He knew this mission wasn't like the others. As he drove to the base, his thoughts were divided. The memory of Anna brought him comfort, but he knew he had to focus on the task ahead. When George arrived at the base, the transition from everyday life to the battlefield was swift. Within minutes, he was surrounded by his teammates, all focused and gearing up for this high-priority mission. The intel was clear, the target was dangerous, and time was of the essence. As he suited up, George's mind wandered for a brief moment. A flash of memory brought back an image of Anna, of the peaceful moments they'd shared together. He remembered their last laugh, what it was like to be by her side without the burden of his military life. But he knew in that moment he couldn't afford to let his mind drift. With conscious effort, George pushed aside thoughts of his personal life and focused on what lay ahead. He was about to dive into a completely different scenario, one where every decision was a matter of life and death. His training, discipline, and the fate of his team depended on his full concentration. Taking a deep breath, George closed his eyes for a second, clearing away any distractions. Focus. He knew he needed to be at his best. The mission awaited, and he was ready. Jake had recently restored his reputation at work by taking down one of the city's biggest drug lords, and life seemed to be returning to normal. Anna and her mother, Jessica, decided to spend the day together and visit a museum hosting a special exhibit. It was supposed to be a pleasant, peaceful day, but fate had other plans. By mid-afternoon, as they strolled through the museum's galleries, chaos erupted. A group of heavily armed terrorists stormed the building, taking many visitors hostage. The gunmen opened fire, injuring and killing several people. Anna and Jessica, terrified, managed to hide in a dark corner, clinging to each other, trying to stay silent as they listened to the shouts and footsteps of the attackers drawing near. Anna was panicked, tears streaming down her face. Jessica placed a hand over her daughter's mouth, trying to stifle her sobs as the terrorists' footsteps approached dangerously close. The terror was overwhelming when the two were discovered and violently dragged from their hiding spot, now hostages in the hands of the criminals. Meanwhile, George and his team had just returned from a grueling international mission. Exhausted, they had barely set foot on base when they were briefed on the terrorist attack at the museum. George, feeling a wave of fear, immediately called Jake. "Jake, do you know where Anna and her mother are?" George asked, his voice tense. Jake, already on edge, responded urgently. "My God, I think they went to the museum today. I'm heading there right now." "I'm going too," George replied quickly. "My team's on the way. We'll take care of this." Wasting no time, George and his unit were mobilized. SEAL Team 6 was about to go into action again, this time on home soil, and the urgency was even greater for George. He had to save Anna and her mother. Inside the museum, the terrorists began making demands. They wanted to negotiate for the hostages as the situation deteriorated. Local authorities had surrounded the building, but they knew the SEALs were en route. The hours dragged on, and the desperation among the hostages grew. Anna and Jessica, now held at gunpoint, were trembling with fear. The situation seemed hopeless. The leader of the terrorists constantly made threats, vowing to kill more hostages if their demands weren't met. Jake, determined to save his family, managed to sneak into the museum unnoticed. Using his police training, he slipped through the hallways, identifying the positions of the terrorists and their weak points. At the right moment, He made contact with George's team, relaying critical information about the gunmen. "Jake, we need your help to coordinate the attack from inside. We're going to neutralize them together," George said as the SEALs silently closed in. Jake, his heart racing, knew this was his chance to save his daughter and wife. He assisted George's team in strategically infiltrating the building, allowing the SEALs to reach the hostages without the terrorists realizing an attack was imminent. When the moment came, the action was swift and effective. With Jake's precise coordination and the SEALs' lethal skill, the terrorists were taken down one by one. George and his team advanced to the area where Anna and Jessica were being held, and within minutes, both women were safe. After the successful rescue, both Jake and George were highly decorated for their bravery and role in resolving the crisis. Jake, who had previously faced humiliation at work, was now regarded as a hero, not just among his colleagues but throughout the city. With the mission behind them and the past finally put to rest, George decided to take Jake to meet his military unit and formally introduce him to his team. It was a moment of full reconciliation, where Jake could see firsthand what George had accomplished and finally come to terms with their history. "You've got an incredible team, George," Jake said, impressed. "Today, I have a much better understanding of what you do and how much you risk." George smiled, pleased with Jake's approval. In return, Jake took George to the police department, proud to show off his son-in-law. Many of his colleagues were equally impressed by George's skills and bravery, and George was even invited to lead a training session on hostage situations, sharing the techniques his team used in rescue operations. Over time, George began to reflect on his future. After years of dedication to SEAL Team 6, he decided it was time to take a different path. He and Anna had grown even closer after the museum incident, and George realized that his priority was now his family. George made the difficult decision to leave the elite military unit and devote himself to the family business. He began working alongside his parents, Christina and Nicholas, in the textile empire they had built. Although stepping away from SEAL Team 6 was a hard choice, George knew it was the right one to ensure a stable future for Anna and the child they had planned to have. Not long after, George and Anna got married in an intimate ceremony, surrounded by friends and family. It wasn't long before the couple welcomed their first child, a boy they named Ethan. Now, George was building a new life, far from the battlefield, but with the same determination that had always guided him. He knew the most important mission of his life was just beginning, caring for his family and building a legacy alongside Anna and Ethan. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming stories. Make sure to hit the notification bell to stay updated with more amazing content. Your support means a lot to us. See you in the next video, which is already on your screen.